Welcome back. New York City schools are recognizing the importance of social emotional learning, commonly referred to as SEL. This approach is known to foster healthy behaviors and cultivate safer school environments with a track record of positive outcomes for students, educators, and the community as a whole. CEO of the Urban Assembly, David Adams, joins me to explore how this approach could have more of a significant impact on young men in our communities. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Kimna, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Now, I had the pleasure of learning a little bit more about the Urban Assembly a few weeks ago. But for those who are unaware, can you actually just tell us what the Urban Assembly is and some of the work that you do?
Absolutely. So, the Urban Assembly is a school solutions organization. We're a nonprofit that designs schools. So, we have 22 schools that hold the Urban Assembly name here in New York City. We also design and scale solutions that support schools across the country. So, we have three areas that we support: social and emotional development, post secondary readiness and access, and high quality academics. And our goal is to advance the economic and social mobility of young people by improving public education.
Now, as CEO, can you just kind of talk a little bit about how this journey began for you? And I'm going to bring it up later on in the interview about like the importance of like just the position that you hold. But can you talk about how that journey started for you?
Absolutely. So I've been CEO of the Urban Assembly for about 2.5 years. My predecessor was Kristen Kearns Jordan, and her predecessor was Richard Kahn. And very proud to serve as their CEO of the Urban Assembly. Prior to this position, I was the Senior Director of Strategy for about a year. And prior to that position, I was the Director of Social and Emotional Learning. Um, as I've moved in my leadership of the Urban Assembly, we've focused our work on developing generalizable and scalable tools and solutions to improve educational outcomes for students across the country.
Now, you also sit on the board of directors of Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Can you talk about that specific experience? And I understand that it's kind of mainly focused on SEL. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I sure can. Uh, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, otherwise known as CASEL, is based in Chicago, Illinois, and they are the organization that actually developed the concept of social and emotional learning. Um, the the work that CASEL has done has really three distinct prongs. One is practice, one is policy, and one is research. So when you think about the work of social and emotional learning, you tend to think about the research that demonstrates its effectiveness in populations across the country. And that's one of the things that CASEL has done is create outstanding research to really ground our field and ensuring that we know what works and why. Now, let's go to the practice side of what CASEL does. CASEL has launched two main practice prongs, and one is called the Collaborating States Initiative. And that the work that they did is that we actually helped states develop guidelines and social and emotional learning standards so that cities, jurisdictions, local jurisdictions could use those standards to promote social and emotional learning in their schools. And we did that across, I think, about 34 states, which is an amazing achievement. And then lastly, we talk about practice. And that's, excuse me, policy. And that work has happened to ensure that, for example, in the federal stimulus funds, social and emotional learning is written into those funds to ensure that schools can use those funds to support the social and emotional outcomes of their students and students in the future.
Now, how do both of these organizations, and you can choose one to focus on if you like, but how do these organizations prioritize emotional intelligence in students, but especially in young men? And I understand, like, for today, like, we want to really focus on the importance of that for a lot of young men in our community. So, can you expand on that?
Sure. So, Kim, when we think about social and emotional learning, we really think about two kinds of competencies. Interpersonal competencies. So, these are competencies that support our ability to interact with other people, things like relationship skills, things like social awareness, the ability to identify social cues, the ability to understand and take perspective of other people. And those are your interpersonal skills. Then you have your intrapersonal skills. And those are skills that are focused on understanding and having awareness of ourselves. Those are skills like emotional identification, self regulation. And those skills really map on very closely to what we think about as emotional intelligence, right? In the emotional intelligence space, and I co wrote a book, The Educator's Practical Guide to Emotional Intelligence. We talk about the ability to map, move, match emotional information to the situation that we are in and the outcome that we're trying to achieve. Now, let's or place that onto the question of what does this mean for young men? We know, for example, that the data around young men demonstrates that, for example, about 80% of students classified as emotionally handicapped, emotionally disturbed in special education are boys. When we look at outcomes like prison or being involved in the criminal justice system, about 90% of those folks are boys. And so when we think about the work we do for social and emotional learning, what we want to do is we want to promote and equip all of our students to be successful in problem solving with themselves and others. And when we apply that to our young men in specific, we know that the better we do at promoting the social and emotional competencies of our young men, the stronger our communities will be, the stronger relationships will be, and the stronger our young men will be in terms of being able to solve problems in the community and other places.
And there's also an effort to start with school age children. So, why is it so important to start with elementary and even middle school students? And do you do any work with high school students?
Great question. So, in fact, most of our work here at the Urban Assembly is with high school students. We do have 22 schools, and these Urban Assembly schools are in three boroughs in Manhattan, in Bronx, and in Brooklyn. And the work of social and emotional learning in Urban Assembly has inspired folks from across the country, in fact, across the world, to invest in the social and emotional development of their kids. And so when we talk about early, middle, and high school students, we talk about a developmental trajectory that integrates these skills across time. And so in elementary school, you might be thinking about making sure that students have the ability to identify their emotions and do simple social tasks like share effectively, communicate their feelings. In middle school, we're going to start to think about how goal setting and more complex emotional tasks like being able to label effectively one's emotion and how it changes over time in response to a situation. By high school, you're really thinking about complex problem solving. We're mapping emotional and social skills to things like employability, to things like civic readiness. We're ensuring that high school students have the ability to resolve conflicts effectively using constructive approaches to that. We're making sure that we can set and achieve goals, that we can manage our emotions effectively, and we can identify social cues in ourselves and others. So, as the developmental trajectory increases in terms of age, the complexity of the skills that we teach increase, and the application of these skills is less about can I do this in the classroom, and more about can I do this in my life? Can I do this in the community? Can I do this on the job? And that's how we think about that spectrum between elementary, middle, and high school for our social emotional learning work.
Now, how could looking at race, gender, and even economic status help in assisting young Black and Brown boys and girls with SEL?
That's another great question. So the great news is that a recent meta-analysis, and the meta-analysis is a collection of multiple studies. And what happens in the meta-analysis is you look at all the research and you try to see what is the general trend of what we know about a field. And the most recent meta-analysis that was conducted on social and emotional learning was done by Dr. Christina Cipriano at Yale University. She led that work. And one of the key outcomes of that is that social and emotional skills work, and social emotional learning works for students regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of rural versus urban versus suburban, even regardless of country. So these skills are foundational and fundamental skills across the spectrum and across demographics. Now, the one thing that is helpful to understand here is that students with a higher risk profile tend to actually make greater gains with universal social and emotional learning programs. So that means that if you have a higher risk factor, you come from a high risk background, and you are exposed to high quality social and emotional learning alongside everyone else, those students actually make higher gains quicker than students with lower risk profiles. So I'm here to say that the work of SCL is for everyone. And as we apply these skills, students benefit in different ways. And the students with the highest risk do the best, have the most gains. And that means that when we do the work, we need to do it for everybody all the time.
Now, I'm curious to know. Are there any challenges, especially when you are working with students, maybe from high risk backgrounds, where being emotional or showing any type of feeling could be considered a negative thing, especially when we're talking about young boys who may have challenges with expressing how they feel and may use other outlets to kind of express how they feel? Are there any challenges when you're trying to teach them SEL?
Well, I got two young sons, Elijah and Isaiah, and I got to let you know that I practice what I preach. My job as a father is to raise sons who know how to constructively solve problems, how to communicate effectively, and to be part of a community or group. So when we think about what does it take to do that, we need to understand that these are skills that allow everybody to be more successful. When I teach my sons how to communicate their needs and feelings effectively, it means that I can respond to them in more constructive ways. The difference between throwing a controller on the ground and taking a breath is the difference between a young person who knows how to manage their emotions and a young person who's on a path of higher risk. So while it is sometimes challenging to teach young men, in particular, the power of communication and the power of being able to be clear and expressive with how you're feeling and how that is impacting what you're trying to accomplish. We know that when we do that well, these young men are on a better path and a better trajectory to success.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up kind of like a personal experience for that question, because my next question was basically going to be talking about visibility and how has your visibility as a successful Black man impact the work that you do with other young Black boys and young men?
That's a great question. There are times when I give speeches and a young Black man or even a middle-aged Black man will come up to me and said, uh, the fact that you are here, the fact that you are speaking the way that you're speaking about the things that you were speaking about has inspired me to go back and do work for myself and to uplift others. And so for me, I feel a responsibility to live up to the expectations and to live up to the folks who delivered me and delivered our community. And that means that I seek to pursue excellence for myself, I seek to pursue excellence for my organization, and I seek to pursue excellence in our schools. And I think when we all understand that we are a product of the sacrifices of those who delivered us, we take that responsibility and we turn it into impact. And that's what I hope to do with my life.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, how do you ensure children, all children, because we mentioned that, SEL is for everyone, how do you ensure that all children feel seen and represented in this type of work? And I bring this up because I think just in general, we talked about boys, but I think being emotional in society is sometimes seen as like a bad thing, even
Mm.
for like young girls when people say, "Oh, you're too emotional," it's always kind of a negative connotation. So, how do you just ensure that like all of these children feel seen, represented, and validated in this type of work?
Well, let's take a step back, right? The first thing I think we all need to understand is that emotions are information. They give us information about ourselves, they give us information about the environment around them. What we do with our emotions matters. And so I assume when people say you're emotional or you're too emotional, right? What I think they probably mean is that your behavior is reflecting your feelings as opposed to your intent. So we can feel many things. We can feel happy, sad, disappointed, angry. We can feel um, elated. We can think about all the ways that we feel. How we manage those emotions, what we do with those feelings, how they drive our interactions. That's what we talk about when we talk about social emotional learning and to a certain extent emotional intelligence. Now, when we're talking to young people, one of the things that's really important is that everybody feels emotions. There's this idea that, especially for young people, that they're the only ones feeling the big emotions. Everything from disappointment to elation, that they are the only ones who ever felt this. But in fact, we've all felt emotions. And as we mature in adults, we learn to express these emotions in ways that are constructive. So at the end of the day, the outcome of high quality SEL is constructive problem solving around inter and intrapersonal skill sets.
Now, SEL also leads to improved academic achievement, which I think is amazing because at the end of the day, that's like one of the biggest goals when you have students in school. You want them to achieve great things academically. Can you just expand on how this could be a game changer for so many Black and Brown communities?
I sure can. One of the key outcomes, again, of Dr. Christina Cipriano's study is that social and emotional learning is a key contributor to academic success. In fact, some research has demonstrated that social and emotional skill development is as important in terms of this, it contributed to academic success as interventions like tutoring and interventions that are based in teaching and learning and curriculum. Now, when we do this work, one of the things that we identified is the pathway between social emotional skills and academic success tends to be through things like self management, goal setting, personal responsibility, and decision making skills. That means that if we focus on teaching young people how to set and achieve goals and how to manage their emotions, how to take in information to make good decisions, they will do better on their academic outcomes. And that's amazing to me, right? Because I think sometimes we think that academic outcomes are almost always content based. How much knowledge do you know? How fast can you process information if we're thinking about IQ and something like that? But in fact, there are these other skills that really are predictive of academic outcomes. And in fact, there was a research study about 1993 by Dr. Catherine Wenzel, and she identified that you could predict graduation rates in 12th grade by looking at students' self-management skills and social emotional skills in third grade. So the takeaway here is that there are some foundational things that every child can learn. And it doesn't matter about your IQ, and it doesn't matter about how fast you read. You can learn how to set and achieve goals. You can learn how to manage your emotions. You can learn how to make good decisions. And if you learn those things, your academic outcomes will improve.
Now we have about a minute left, and I really want to know, how is SEL evolving to match the interests and goals of kids today? I hear so many people say, our kids are constantly changing. Are there any plans to evolve, or, what we have now, is this kind of like where we want to stay?
Well, we're always changing in the field of social and emotional learning. Some exciting things that are happening is there's now a social and emotional learning journal of policy, practice, and research. There is a new handbook of social and emotional learning coming out, and I'm happy to preview some of the cool things that are happening. One is that the field is really looking at the role of technology in social and emotional learning. And how to engage students digitally in different spaces to teach social and emotional skills. And then the other thing we're always looking at is how to integrate social and emotional skills more explicitly in academic spaces, as well as after school and post secondary spaces, so that young people can get SEL everywhere all the time because we know that it works.
All right, David, I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. And I really enjoyed it because, as I mentioned, like students are always learning. And I don't think this was something that I was taught about in high school or middle school or elementary school. And I'm so glad that it's being kind of like taught to children now. So, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this.
Thanks so much for having me.
We have to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this.